Shoot. I didn't see your chat. Sorry. Okay, now I'm recording. So we want to develop a theory of inflation in this chapter. And luckily we have a good theory, right? A theory that has stood the test of time, actually. Sorry, I want to share something different with you. Right? We do have a theory of inflation that has, as I said, withstood the test of time, right? And we refer to this theory as the quantity theory of money. This dates all the way back to the philosopher you might be familiar with, Thomas Hume. Right? So this even predates the Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, right? I mean, this is actually a theory about why we have money and what causes inflation that really predates economics itself. And so Hume, who was a philosopher, also dabbled a little bit in thinking about social organization. And one of the things that Hume was interested in, he didn't call himself an economist because there were no economists, but he was really interested in this idea of money, right? And why do we have money? Why is it that money is always used in societies? That rarely do we have societies exist and economies exist in which something doesn't begin to serve the form of money, meaning something doesn't begin to be used as an intermediate good in exchange, right? So we know hopefully you know what a barter economy is. A barter economy is when you trade a good for a good. But that's very difficult to do, right? Particularly, if you have unusual goods, like if you raise sheep and you want to buy a car, it's going to be hard to take some sheep and go buy a car because chances are the person who has a car doesn't want your sheep, and so you have a problem. So what we usually have is we have intermediate goods that serve as money, right? Money is basically a link that you can break one complicated transaction of barter into two separate transactions, right? I can trade my sheep for money, and then I can take that money and go buy a car. And so this is really what Thomas Hume thought, right? Thomas Hume said, why do we have money? Well, we use money to make trade easier. We eliminate the double coincidence of wants. In other words, money is a medium of exchange. It's a way to make trade easier. That's why we have money. One of the other things that Hume notes, and this is a bit of an aside for where we're going, but I just think it's interesting to talk about, is you also have to think about money is a measure of trust. Because why do I accept money? I accept money only because I think other people will accept money, right? I accept money because I think other people will accept money. So, why is it that I somehow trust that every Friday when I get paid, there's going to be some mysterious numbers show up in my bank account. And then I can use those mysterious numbers to go pay for my everything I buy. Well, in many ways, it's a system of trust, right? I trust those numbers because I trust other people trust those numbers, right? And so one of the things that Hume and many other economists have talked about is you really have to think about money as basically a network of trust, right? That money has a very big trust element. And when trust breaks down in your society, money often will break down as well. And when money breaks down, then usually your economy will break down, right? Because it's going to be much, much harder for you to conduct trade in goods and services. So this was kind of the insight of Hume, and Hume took it a little bit further, right? He then wanted to think about, well, then what causes inflation? So this is what Hume said. First off, let's make some definitions. Okay, let's have a few definitions here. The first definition is what we call the monetary base. The monetary base is C plus R. C is currency. And R is reserves held by banks. Okay, so the money that is held by a bank is money. It is a form of money, right? A deposit held by a bank is a form of money, right? So when banks hold reserves, that is money that they could lend out and put into the economy. Then there's M1. M1 is C plus D. C is currency. And D is deposits. We won't talk about this definition very much, but I'm just going to give it to you to illustrate that there's really more than one form of money in an economy. You can also measure money as M2. And M2 is everything that's in M1 plus savings accounts and money market accounts, right? Money market accounts are accounts that hold extremely liquid assets, like treasury bills or commercial paper. For those of you who've taken money in banking, you might remember what commercial paper is: short-term bonds, right? So these are accounts in which the assets in it are very liquid, very easy to turn into money. And so there are multiple definitions of money because multiple things can serve as money within an economy, okay? Later, we will talk about the importance of each of these when we talk more about monetary policy in general. But for right now, when I talk about money, I'm going to be using M1 because M1 is, how should we say this? M1 is the thing that is most clearly money within an economy. So when you go over to the grocery store, can you buy things with currency? Yes. Can you buy things with a bank deposit? Yes, you could write a check, or you could use your bank app, right? So those of you who use things like Apple Pay or Venmo, you notice that all of those are tied directly to a bank deposit, right? They're all tied directly to a bank deposit. So yeah, M1 are things that are clearly money, right? They are things that are clearly money. And so we're typically going to use this as our definition of the money supply. We'll talk more about the monetary base later when we talk about monetary policy. Those of you who took money in banking, you might remember, the monetary base is the portion of M1 that the central bank controls, okay? So monetary base is what the central bank controls. So remember that the central bank doesn't have perfect control over the money supply, but they do have perfect control over the monetary base. And we'll go back and talk about this relationship here in a few days. Right? So M1 is currency plus deposits. These are things that are clearly money. Why don't we have credit cards here? Well, the reason is credit cards aren't actually a way of paying. They're a way of deferring payment, right? So when you buy something with a credit card, you're not really paying it. They're still the credit card's gonna send you a bill, right? And then how do you have to pay for it? You either pay for it with currency, I don't know exactly how you would do that nowadays, or through a bank deposit, right? And so things like credit cards don't change, they're not part of the money supply. Now, having said that, they do change how people use money, right? Undoubtedly, they change how people use money. For instance, most of us probably have almost no currency in our pockets nowadays, right? That we've moved almost, we're increasingly moving to electronic money that's closely tied to electronic deposits in banks. So one of the things that's happened to the M1 is that the amount of currency that's in circulation has really declined quite significantly. And what's happened during COVID has only increased this, right? I don't know about you, I'm trying to think about the last time I actually used some real money, right? Some physical currency to buy something. I mean, I've almost completely gone to using a credit card or using Venmo or things like this, in part because it reduces contact with people, right? And so what's happening in the US though, has definitely happened in other economies and other parts of the world that have much, much more quickly than the US moved to electronic money, right? So those of you who are from China, you know this very well, or have visited China, right? China is many years ahead of us in terms of actually using electronic money. As are, for instance, Northern Europe, right? Scandinavian countries are have moved to electronic money much quicker than we have. So anyway, all these new innovations in finance are changing the nature of M1, but M1 is still the fundamental form of money in our economy. Now, how does this relate to inflation, right? That's the question. So the quantity theory of money posed by David Hume is that Hume says this has to be true. M times V is equal to P times Y. Okay, what's M? M is the money supply. Okay, which we defined as M1. V is what we call velocity. Velocity is the number of times a unit of money changes hands. So velocity is basically how quickly money is moving through the economy. So for instance, a velocity of 3 would mean that every period, a unit of money is changing hands 3 times. Y is real spending. right? Or you could think about this as real GDP, real aggregate expenditure. And then finally, P is the price level. So Hume says this has to be true. M times V is equal to P times Y, right? So let's think about this. If you think about this P times Y, that's just nominal GDP, right? The right-hand side of this equation is just nominal GDP. And then what's the left-hand side of this equation say? This is telling us, really, if the right-hand side is total spending, what's the left-hand side? The left-hand side is essentially the effective money supply. Right? It's the effective money supply, how much we can effectively spend based on money. Because remember, the only way you can spend is by having money here. Right? You can only spend if you have money here. So let's say that there's an increase in total spending within the economy, right? The right-hand side of this goes up. What has to happen on the left-hand side? To support more spending, right? So let me write this. To have more spending in the economy, then one of two things has to be true. Either you have to have more money, or you have to see that money changing hands more quickly. Okay? So either you have more money, or you have to see that money changing hands more quickly to support that more spending. All right, so if you want to increase spending, nominal spending has to be supported by either more money or more velocity. So let's just think of a simple example here. Let's say that the money supply is equal to 500 and real output is 1,000 and the velocity of money is 4, meaning every unit of currency or every unit of money changes hands 4 times. What is P? What's going to be the price level? Well, we know MV is equal to PY, right? What's M? Okay, M is 500 and V is 4. So the left-hand side of this is 2,000. What's Y? 1,000. And so what's the price level going to be? The price level is going to adjust to make this true. In other words, the price level is going to have to be 2. That's what's going to have to be true about the price level so that the quantity theory of money holds. okay? So that's the, I think that the nutshell or the basic insight of the quantity theory, right? Is the quantity theory is posing a specific relationship between the money supply, velocity, the price level, and real output, right? So it takes those four variables and says there's a strict relationship between them, right? There's a strict relationship between them. Now, Hume and other economists take this one step further. They say, well, listen, that's all fine and good, but we have to think about exactly what determines velocity and real output in the money supply and the price level, right? That's all fine that they're related, but how do we know what determines what? And so in classical economics, there has been this assertion that economies behave according to money neutrality, right? What does this theory say? The classical theory of money neutrality simply says that in the long run, nominal variables, meaning variables measured in prices such as M and P, do not impact real variables such as velocity or output, real output. So why are money and prices a nominal variable? Because they're measured in current prices. But notice that real output and velocity are not measured in prices. They're real variables. Okay? So, actually, I'll erase this here for a second. So, where in the world does this assertion come from? Right? How is it that classical economists can say that the money supply doesn't affect the money supply and other nominal variables don't impact real variables in the long run? Well, let me give you a thought example, right? That maybe hopefully kind of explains where classical economists are come from. Let's say that the Fed conducts an experiment of money neutrality, right? And what they ask is that everybody in the United States has to take their green dollar bills to the Fed. You take your green dollars to the Fed, and in return, you get 2 red dollars. Okay? So if you take a green $20 bill to the Fed, they give you 2 red $20 bills. Okay? In this thought experiment, what's happened to the money supply? It's doubled, right? Now we have twice as much money as we had before. What should happen to prices? Prices should double, right? Now when we re-express prices in terms of red dollar bills instead of green dollar bills, prices should double. But should that impact real variables? Should that make us produce more? Should that make the velocity of money change? No, that's what classical economists say, right? If you think back to what we talked about last week, when we talked about why countries grow faster or slower in the long run, did we ever talk about inflation? No, because inflation shouldn't matter in the long run, right? What does matter? How much capital you have, how much labor you have, how much productivity you have, right? These are the things that impact real growth in the long run. So nominal variables only impact other nominal variables. They don't impact real variables. From the perspective of the classical theory, we can treat V and Y as exogenous. In other words, they're fixed. They're determined by other things. They're determined by things that are not in this model, such as capital and labor and productivity. So M times V bar is equal to P times Y bar. Or we can rewrite this like this. So now in this formulation of the quantity theory, what causes an increase in the price level? In other words, what causes inflation? Only increases in the money supply. So if we rewrite this in terms of growth rates, using our rules that we developed in chapter 2 last week, we can rewrite this as follows. Okay. The percentage change in P is equal to the percentage change in the money supply plus the percentage change in the velocity minus the percentage change in Y. This is just inflation. So if V is constant, we can just drop this out, right? If we assume that velocity is constant because it's exogenous, then we can just rewrite this equation as follows. Inflation is equal to the percent change in the money supply minus the percent change in output. What's true in the quantity theory? Inflation is driven by too much money growth. It's the growth of the money supply that drives inflation. In the long run, let me rephrase that, in the long run, because remember, this is a long run theory. So, to think about a simple example, let's say that output growth is 2% and money growth is 20%. What's going to be inflation? 18%. So inflation is going to be highly correlated with money growth. Inflation is driven by too much money growth. It is essentially monetary policy determines the inflation rate. In the long run. And let me keep on stressing this, right? Because this is a long run theory. When we move to the short run in the next couple of days, we'll say, yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than this, right? But in the long run, this is the prediction of the quantity theory. Why has the quantity theory been around for almost 300 years now? Well, it's pretty simple. The quantity theory has been around for 300 years because the predictions it makes hold up in the real world, right? You don't have a theory that lasts 300 years without it being a pretty strong predictor of actual behavior. And so when we look here at the data, we actually see that the quantity theory does a really good job of explaining what we observe over the long run, right? So let me show you a couple of graphs here. First off, let's look at figure 8.3. This is inflation and money growth in the United States. So on the horizontal axis, we see money growth, and the vertical axis, we see inflation. And what do we see in each of these decades? Yeah, during decades where we had faster money growth, we had higher inflation. There's a strong positive relationship between the two. Is the relationship perfect? No. But then again, the quantity theory doesn't say the relationship is going to be perfect. It just says it's going to be strong, right? And here we do see a strong relationship between money growth over a 10-year period and inflation over a 10-year period in the United States. What happens if we look out to other countries? We see that this relationship is even stronger. That if we look at the average money growth in a country, we see it is strongly correlated with the average inflation rate in the country. And so why is it that, for instance, a country like Angola has averaged almost 500% inflation, right, over this period? Because they have a lot of money growth, right? As I say here at the bottom of the page, sustained inflation is a monetary phenomenon. That's the prediction of the quantity theory, and that strongly holds with what we observe in the real world in the long run. So in the long run, monetary policy is the big determinant of inflation. Now I keep on saying in the long run, in the long run, in the long run. Why am I keep on saying in the long run? Because when we begin to talk about the short run, we're going to see that it's a lot more complicated, right? That there are other things that can contribute to inflation in the short run. And also, we're going to have real questions about the theory of money neutrality, right? So this theory of money neutrality that's embedded in this version of the quantity theory says that, you know, if you go back to the example I talked about a minute ago, if you take a red dollar bill and turn it into two, or sorry, if you take a green dollar bill and you turn it into two red dollar bills, what happens? Well, in that very, you know, simple example, the price level doubles and output doesn't change. But what happens if you did this on the sly, and instead of trading a green dollar bill for a red dollar bill, you just printed up more green dollar bills and you didn't tell anybody? Do you think then maybe real behavior would start to change? Quite possible, right? Because of imperfect information, or maybe markets are not perfectly flexible. And those are going to be the things we talk about when we begin talking about the short run, right? When we move to a model of the short run, we're going to have to think about what happens when we don't have perfect information about the world. What happens when markets are not perfectly flexible, right? Those are going to be the things that we have to begin talking about. But here in the long run, where markets are flexible and we have perfect information, it's pretty clear what causes inflation, right? And that's monetary policy, right? Monetary policy. So that's a, you know, a very, very strong prediction of the quantity theory. And the fact that it matches the data so well is a testament to why it's hung around here for 300 years or more. Okay, let's take a little bit of a break, okay? So maybe 5 minutes or so. Get up, stretch around, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about why talking about inflation is important, right? So now that we've talked about where it comes from, why are we worried about inflation, right? What's the macroeconomic impacts of inflation? So we'll pick up on that here in a couple minutes. All right, have a good break.
Do we have a guest lecture here,
I have a
Todd?
lecture. Yes, Wendell. Wendell wants to see what you all look like. He wants to see if you are a better looking group than his first grade group. So you're all going to have to come back on and let Wendell look at your faces. How do they look to you? Oh, thumbs up. Very nice. They're a good looking group, you think? They're better. They look better than your first graders? Wow. Wendell's not getting a haircut during COVID. Maybe some of you are following the same thing. Max, are you taking the same advice? You're not getting your haircut during COVID? See? That's, you see that? All right. We got work to do. I think you got to leave. Okay, bud? I'm going to say bye. All right. If you guys think it's bad, just imagine being in first grade and having to take everything by Zoom, man. It sucks. It sucks. Not that it's great for you. I'm not saying that it's great for you guys. It sucks to be in college and have to do all this stuff on Zoom. And yeah, I have to social distance, but it definitely sucks having to do it on first grade. So anyway. All right. So I think maybe we're all coming back here. So let's talk here a little bit about why we worry about inflation, right? What are the economic consequences of inflation? Okay. When we think about the economic consequences of inflation, we really have to first begin by talking about something that I'm sure many of you have seen in other economics courses. The distinction between real and nominal interest rates, right? We can't make a distinction between real and nominal interest rates unless we understand what inflation is, right? And so we know that when you go to a bank and you request a loan, what they are actually quoting you is a nominal interest rate, right? It's paid back in real dollars. I'm sorry, it's paid back in current dollars, right? Paid back in current dollars. So if you buy a car, it's a $5,000 car and you pay a 10% interest rate, then you basically have to pay $500 a year. But that's current dollars, right? That's a nominal interest rate. So when the bank quotes you that 5%, where are they really getting that 5%? Well, there's two components to it. The first is the bank has to have some expectation of what they think inflation is going to be over the period of that loan. No bank in their right mind would charge you less than the expected inflation rate. So if a bank thinks that inflation is going to be 2%, there's no way they would charge you less than 2% interest, right? Because what that means is that the dollars they get back in the future are going to be worth less in real terms, right? There's no profit to be made in that. But of course, a bank doesn't want to just lend you money at expected inflation, because then you're not going to have any real profit. And so that's what the real interest rate is. The real interest rate is the interest that you pay over and above inflation. And as I said, that's really a measure of the real profit that a bank earns. So that nominal interest rate that's quoted at a bank, it really has two components, the real interest rate and the expected inflation rate, right? And so real interest rates are what really matters. It's how much you have to pay over and above expected inflation. When we look at the real interest rate, and then we compare it to the nominal interest rate, do we see this close relationship? Well, kind of, but there's a complication here. So here's looking at nominal interest rates in the US and then looking at real interest rates. Notice that they do tend to move together, but sometimes there can be big differences between the two. What's going on here? Well, the difference, the reason why the real interest rate and the nominal interest rate don't always move together is because sometimes actual inflation is different from real inflation or expected inflation, right? And so that's the problem, right? Or that's the complication. Right? The complication here is that sometimes actual inflation is not equal to the expected inflation rate. In fact, we really have to think about two different types of real interest rate. One is the ex ante real interest rate. Ex ante, Latin meaning before the fact. This is the expected real return. Okay, so the ex ante real interest rate is the difference between the nominal interest rate and expected inflation. It's the expected real return. But then there's another interest rate that matters. Oops. And that's the ex post real interest rate, which is the difference between the nominal interest rate and the actual inflation rate. Which is the actual real return. So when actual inflation is not equal to expected inflation, it creates winners and losers. Why? Because the ex ante real interest rate no longer equals the ex post real interest rate. Whenever you have unexpected inflation, right, it creates winners and losers because the ex ante real interest rate doesn't equal the ex post real interest rate. Okay, so let's move to a discussion about the cost of inflation, because when talking about inflation, we can see why this is costly for society. Okay. One of the big costs of inflation is that unexpected inflation redistributes wealth and it kills finance over time. And we can understand this when we go back to thinking about ex post and ex ante real interest rates. Okay. So let's talk about a couple of examples here. The first example I want to talk about is what happened in the 1970s when we began to see, sorry, typo. When we began to see unexpected inflation in the United States, right? So we saw that graph earlier of inflation going up and up. Much of that increase in inflation was not expected. It was not expected. So in other words, actual inflation ended up being much bigger than expected inflation. So some of you, if you've had me in principles or I'm sure in money and banking, I use the same story, but I often talk about my mom and dad, right? Who bought a house in 1970. And so in 1970, they bought a 30-year mortgage at 4%. What was the bank thinking? Well, the bank was probably expecting inflation to be about 2%, which is where it had been throughout most of the 1960s. Meaning, what was the real interest rate that the bank was expecting to get? 2%. That's the rough expectation of the bank. Is the bank thought, well, we're going to get 2% real return on this money. What happened ex post? What happens if we play this out into 1980? What was my parents paying? My parents were still paying the same 4%. They had got a 30-year mortgage. But what was actual inflation? 14%. Meaning, what was the ex post real interest rate? Negative 10%. This just killed banks. It was great for people like my parents who borrowed money at a very, very low rate, but it was horrible for banks, right? It killed them. And so what this example proves is that unexpected inflation hurts lenders and benefits borrowers. But something that continues to hurt lenders again and again and again, eventually what's going to happen? People won't lend money, right? And so that's the danger of this. You might say, well, some people win, some people lose, who cares? The thing is, if the losers keep on losing, they're going to stop lending. And this becomes a big disincentive to lend money over time, right? When you live in an environment in which inflation is unpredictable, it's a big discouragement to lending. This is what lenders worry about, right? Lenders worry about nothing more than unexpected inflation, because unexpected inflation is one of the easiest way to see your wealth eaten up, right? So that's just a classic example of where ex post can be a lot different from ex ante, and what you think you're going to get when you enter into a financial transaction turns out to be much different than what you do get. Let's talk about another example here on the opposite Let's talk about the unexpected deflation that happened during the 1930s during the Great Depression. When inflation was actually less than zero, meaning deflation, right? Prices were falling. And they were significantly less than what expected inflation was expected to be. So what happens in this case? What was true about the ex-ante real interest rate? In other words, the real interest rate that borrowers were expecting to pay. It turned out to be much less than the ex-post real interest rate. So in real terms, borrowers ended up paying much, much more than what they expected to pay. In theory, this should have benefited lenders and it should have hurt borrowers. But you notice I put a question mark here because it's not that simple. Because what happens if something hurts borrowers too much? They just don't pay money back, right? And so that's exactly what happened during the Great Depression. That many of these borrowers simply could not pay the money back. And as a result, banks failed and we had a massive bank crisis in the United States, right? Once again, crushing finance. So in 1932, 40% of farms in Iowa were behind in their payments. Right? 40% of the farms in Iowa were behind in their payments. So farmers, remember what's happening during deflation. Prices are falling, right? The prices of the goods that they produce are falling. But what happened to the amount that they had to pay to the bank? That was actually going up in real terms, right? So while the economy's in the tank and prices are falling, borrowers found that they had to pay the same amount, right? Meaning the real amount that they had to pay had gone up. Many farmers just simply said, I can't pay it. And as soon as they started defaulting, then banks started to default. So while in theory it could have helped banks, in practice it killed banks because things that are too bad for borrowers aren't good for banks either because people won't pay their money back. And so this is why, this is one of the big reasons why we worry about finance, or we worry about inflation. Inflation kills finance, right? It reduces the value over time. It reduces the incentives to save. It reduces borrowing. It reduces capital accumulation and reduces education because people can't borrow money to do these things. It reduces aggregate productivity, right? Because people cannot borrow to invest in the things that they need to invest in. And so this is why economists worry about inflation. One of the reasons why we worry about inflation is we really worry about its impact on creating winners and losers and discouraging finance. Some of you might have heard this little fun fact. This is one of my favorite fun facts about inflation. If you took $1 million right? $1 million and put it into an Argentinian bank in 1960. Okay, so if you took $1 million, put it into an Argentinian bank in 1960, in which it was converted to pesos, what would it be worth in US dollars today? Right? So in other words, what would be the real value of $1 million in pesos in 1960? That much. That much of a cent, right? $1 million would have been depreciated by that much in terms of real purchasing power parity. Because what's happened in inflation in Argentina? Inflation has averaged, well, I mean, I don't know exactly what it's averaged, but they've had years of inflation of greater than 3,000%, right? And many years in which inflation's been more than 100%. And so over time, just like growth can lead to huge increases in the value of money, price growth can lead to huge decreases in the value of money, right? And so basically $1 million in wealth would have almost completely depreciated to zero by the high steady inflation in Argentina since 1960. And so you can imagine, what's your incentive to save in the Argentinian financial system? Zero, right? I mean, most Argentinian banks have been ruined by this, right? By the constant, uncertainty related to inflation and the dysfunction that goes along with it. So what's best for growth? Well, what's best for growth, it doesn't so much matter what the level of inflation is, but that it's stable and predictable, right? Stable and predictable inflation is the best for growth because it encourages finance and it encourages people to make investments. The actual level of inflation is probably less important, right? It's less important whether inflation is 2% or 5% or even 10% or even 100%. As long as people know what is happening to it, then people can make do, right? People can make do. Very briefly, I want to talk about some other costs of inflation, right? So we talked about, if I can flip back here, one cost of inflation, which is that unexpected inflation redistributes wealth and it kills finance. But there's some other costs of inflation too that I think are worth knowing about. Right? One is a transaction costs, right? That inflation discourages the use of money and it makes trade harder. To pick an extreme example here, there are stories from Brazil in the 1980s when Brazil had a 3,000% inflation rate. And so a 3,000% inflation rate, to put that in some perspective, basically means that inflation is doubling about every week, prices are doubling about every week. And so you don't want to be holding a lot of money in that environment because when you hold money, it's actually losing value every second. And so what people in Brazil began to do is they would take a wheelbarrow to work and they would get paid twice a day. They get paid at lunch, and they'd fill up the wheelbarrow with money and then run down to the market and spend it all as quick as they could. Because every second, that money was losing its value. Then they go back and work in the afternoon. They get paid again. They fill up the wheelbarrow even a little bit higher, and then they run down and they spend all their money, right? That's not a particularly efficient trading system, right? That creates a lot of cost for people, right? It also creates a lot of confusion. In 2008, I was in Zimbabwe, who at the time had a 100% a day inflation rate. So prices were doubling every day in Zimbabwe in 2008. When I was there, it cost 50 billion Zimbabwe dollars to ride the bus, right? 50 billion Zimbabwe dollars. In fact, I think I have, I don't have it here. I have a $100 trillion Zimbabwe bill that I use as a bookmark, right? To show you how fast prices were going up in Zimbabwe. And so, you know, when you go to a store in Zimbabwe, most people weren't using Zimbabwe dollars because they just simply lost value too quickly. But when you went to a Zimbabwe store, you know, it was really difficult to know, like, what should the price of things be when prices are changing that fast? Like, is $50 billion to ride the bus a good deal or a bad deal? I have no idea, right? I have no idea what the price should be because prices are changing too much. And that, once again, that kind of confusion is not going to be great for trade. Inflation, sustained inflation also tends to encourage malinvestment, right? India holds some crazy percentage of the world's gold. Why? Because people don't want to put their money in banks. They don't trust banks, in part because they don't trust inflation. They don't trust that inflation is going to be steady. So instead of putting their money in a bank, what do? They hold yellow pieces of rock. And of course, holding yellow rock in the long run is going to reduce investment and productivity because those yellow rocks are going to do nothing to contribute to economic progress. As opposed to putting your money in a bank in countries that have working financial systems, in which that money then gets funneled to people who have new ideas. Another example of this is the housing bubble in China. Without getting into all of the details here, inflation in China, it's hard to say what inflation in China is, quite honestly. The government reports statistics on inflation, but almost certainly inflation is underreported, right? That inflation is much higher in China than what the government reports it. Also in China, there are lots of interest rate ceilings, right? Meaning interest rates are basically fixed by the government. And they're fixed at a rate in which the ex post real interest rate in China is often negative, meaning you get a negative return on saving money in a Chinese bank. And so that doesn't create a lot of incentive to put your money in Chinese banks. So where do you hold your money? You could put it in the Chinese stock market, but of course nobody trusts the Chinese stock market. There's not really much of a bond market in China. And so people who have savings, and that's a lot of people in China, because many people in China save very, very high fractions of their income, they need to find a place to save their money. And so one of the most attractive places to save your money is to put it in real estate, to buy housing, right? With the idea that it's, you know, safe as houses, right? And so what this has done is this has meant that a huge fraction of the savings in China goes into the housing market, pushing housing prices up and up and up and up, right? So today in China, if you look in the major Chinese cities, the average housing price is about 10 to 15 times per capita income, right? 10 to 15 times. So the usual rule of thumb in the United States is that you should buy a house that is 2 to 3 times your income. In China, people are buying houses that are 10 to 15 times their income, right? It's hard to understand the most housing prices in China based on fundamentals. Why then are people continuing to buy houses? Well, because there's this real pressure to put your money somewhere, right? To put your money somewhere. And that is a form of malinvestment, right? Because a lot of that money could probably be going to more productive uses, but it's not because of the incentive structure that's set up. And so these are probably not all of the costs of inflation, but these are many of the costs of inflation, right? Some of the big ones. And so this is why economists worry about inflation, particularly in the long run, right? Is that inflation creates negative incentives to save and invest in ideas, right? And so while we didn't have inflation in the Romer model and in the Solow model last week, you can think about low steady inflation as one of those things that creates good institutions, right? That low steady inflation leads to productive institutions. It creates the incentives for people to invest in making things instead of taking things. All right then, well then you might say, well, if inflation is so bad, then why do governments create inflation? Right? Why do governments create inflation by printing up so much money? And here, there's really two reasons why governments do this. The first one is that many governments print money to pay their bills. It's a way to essentially monetize your government debt, turn your government debt into money. Or another way you can think about this is an inflation tax. Instead of collecting money through taxes, you collect money by printing up money. So think about a government budget constraint. A very simple government budget constraint. On one hand, you have government spending. G is government purchases of goods and services, and TR is transfer payments, meaning government transfers money to individuals, maybe in the form of unemployment insurance or welfare benefits or health insurance, etc. Right? All sorts of transfer payments. So purchases plus transfer payments together equals government spending. Now, how are governments going to pay for that? They can really pay in three ways. They can collect taxes, they can issue bonds, or they can print money. So what often happens in some countries. Countries that have dysfunctional governments, dysfunctional institutions, weak legal systems, unstable markets and economies, often find that it's very difficult to tax people, right? Either because of the politics involved or because they just simply don't have the system engaged to tax. Many countries don't have bond markets in which to borrow. And even if they could, nobody would lend the government any money. And so if you can't tax and you can't borrow, what are you going to do? Print money, right? And so this is essentially what leads to hyperinflations. Hyperinflation is technically any inflation rate that's greater than 1,000%. But almost always, these are caused by debt crises and governments being forced to print money to pay the bills. And so countries that have had these high inflation rates have often resorted to just printing money to pay the bills. And what does that eventually do? It works for a time, right? It works for a time, but then almost inevitably, as inflation begins to catch up, your economy begins to crumble and it doesn't work. Let me just show you a couple of things here. First, this is an actual sign that I saw in a bathroom in Zimbabwe. It said, toilet paper only to be used in this toilet. No cardboard, no cloth, no Zimbabwe dollars, no newspaper, right? So signs that literally said you could not use Zimbabwe money as toilet paper. That goes to tell you how much Zimbabwe money was worth, right? And that's because the government had literally printing up money hand over fist, right? If you look at high inflation episodes in some of these countries, you see that, here we have countries, Argentina had an inflation rate of over 3,000, Brazil over 2,000, right? Venezuela, right, recently has had a hyperinflation. I think in 2020, Venezuela's inflation rate reached 3,000%, right? In all of these cases, the ultimate problem was a lack of a budget, how should I say this? Basically a budget crisis, right? That the countries were spending a lot more than they were able to collect in taxes. There was no avenue for them to borrow, and so they just printed up money to pay their bills. And so what this means is that usually how does a hyperinflation end? A hyperinflation first has to end when you get your budget situation in order, right? So usually what countries have to do is they have to cut their spending and try to get their budget in order so that they don't just have to print up money to pay their bills. So that is one of the main causes of inflation, particularly very high inflation, right? Very high inflation is almost always caused by a debt crisis, meaning a government debt crisis, meaning you're not able to pay your bills, right? And so that's number one, right? That's one reason why governments print up too much money, is they print up money to pay their bills. There is a second reason, right? There is a second reason why governments often print up too much money. This one, though, we're going to have to talk more about next week. And that is sometimes central banks have set their output targets too high. If central banks push for output that is too high, it's going to lead to inflation over time. Right? So for instance, what happens if the central bank sets a target that's greater than the natural rate of output? We're going to argue that that's going to push up actual inflation above expected inflation. And as we're going to talk about, this is the reason why inflation went up in the 1970s. Is because the central bank, the Fed, set an output target that was too high, and that led to rising inflation over time. And so let me just say, we'll talk more about this later, right? when we move to short run macro, right, which is basically where we're headed after your exam on tomorrow, right? But as we kind of move to the short run, we're going to have to talk about this relationship between output and the natural rate of output and inflation. Okay. Just one last thing before I let you go here is we talked about high inflation in the 70s. But let's talk a little bit about low inflation today, right? One of the things that we've observed is that inflation today is much lower than it's been in the past. And it's not just true in the US, there's really been global disinflation, right? Global disinflation. That inflation across the globe has really shrunk. This began in the 1980s, right? And partly this was a purposeful policy. The Federal Reserve dramatically reduced the money supply in an effort to reduce inflation. Right? We'll talk about this example in more detail when we move to short run. But one of the things that happened in the 1980s, and you can see here in this graph to the left, is that the Fed dramatically reduced inflation from upwards of 14% to down below 4% in just a matter of 2 years. So the Fed dramatically, purposely reduced inflation by cutting money growth. Of course, that came at a cost, and the cost was it led to a big recession. And we'll talk about why that is. And so you can see on the right-hand side of this panel that the US ran a pretty significant recession at the same time that inflation was going down. Since then, we've seen kind of across the globe that inflation has been much steadier and much lower. And partly this is because central banks have become much more wary of inflation. They really understand the importance or the costs of inflation that we've talked about. Also, central banks, I think, have really begun to emphasize the importance of having strong financial systems. And as I said before, to have a strong financial system, you really need to have steady inflation. And so central banks have been much more worried about inflation, much more cognizant of trying to keep inflation steady and keep expected inflation steady. This has also been helped, though, by a supply issue, which is global supply chains. Global supply chains have undoubtedly increased productivity, and they've aimed they've served to keep inflation low by keeping prices low. Of course, you could also argue that they've kept wages low. And so this is the flip side of these global supply chains, right? Is that they've increased productivity and kept prices low, but it's also created a lot of competition in labor markets, which is what we talked about yesterday. And so while prices have been kept low, wages in many industries have also been kept low by all this competition. If you look here in the 2000s, you can see, I'm sorry, to back up. This is just looking at inflation in the US over a much longer period of time. And so you can kind of really see we had, in the 1920s and 1930s, we had deflation, and then we had kind of rising inflation until 1980. And now we're on this downwards track, right? And as I said, I think this downward track has really been caused by two things. One is just much stricter monetary policy, as central banks really don't want to repeat what they consider to be very costly mistakes during the 1970s. And then the other is aggregate supply, that globalization and new technologies have really kept inflation down by increasing productivity, right? So anyway, that we kind of live in a new era of inflation. I think many times when we spend a whole day talking about inflation, the general public doesn't think about inflation very much anymore, and that's a good thing, right? The fact that that most people may not be able to tell you what the inflation rate is right off the top of their head is probably a good thing, because having lived, well, I mean, I wasn't very old during the 1970s, but having kind of lived through it, or at least been a young kid, there was a period of time where people spent all their time thinking about the inflation rate. And if you've lived in countries that have much higher inflation, you realize that people spend a ton of time worrying about the inflation rate. And that's not a good thing, right? The more time you spend worrying about inflation, the less time you spend focusing on making, life more productive and making life better. And so that has been, I think, a big accomplishment of monetary policy. And so we'll talk about this all more, as I said, when we move to the short run macro in a couple of days. Okay, well, right on time. I think that basically finishes up chapter 8 for us. So we won't be covering any new material this afternoon. This afternoon, really we'll do two things. First off, I'm gonna go over homework number 2. I'm gonna try to go over that pretty slowly and pretty carefully, because I did have, I think many of us did okay on homework number 2, but there were definitely some points of confusion that I want to try to talk about. So we'll go over homework number 2 fairly carefully. Make sure that you look over your own homework number 2 before class this afternoon, so that if you have questions, you have a chance to ask about them. And then after that, we will just have some open time for talking about the exam. So if you have any questions about this, that, or the other related to the exam, happy to talk about that. All right, so that will be the only thing we do this afternoon. All right. Okay, great. Thanks for everything, and we will see you back here at 12:30.
Before you go, could you scroll to the top of your notes that we missed in the recording? You don't need to explain it, just in case we missed anything.
Yes. Actually,
for the inflation rate calculations. I think that's what it was.
Can you remember exactly, Cole, what it was?
It was the very first thing you did with your iPad notes.
Okay, hold on one second. This?
Yeah, that was it. And then I think it went down to the monetary base is where it recording started.
So we talked about the 2 measures of inflation. The first one is what we talked about in chapter 2, right? Which is the aggregate price level, and that's just repeating information from chapter 2. And then we talked about the consumer price index, which is basically the same as the aggregate price level, but instead of looking at GDP, we just look at the nominal price of a basket relative to the real price of a basket, and then take the percentage change in that. Okay, so we talked about those two things, and then I think the other thing we talked about then, the last thing before I turned on, was we talked about how you can use the consumer price index to calculate to compare real values over time, right? So I use this example. We had this consumer price index, and we're told gas was 27 cents in 1950. How much is that in 2018 dollars? Well, you have to take that 27 cents and multiply it by the ratio of prices today relative to prices in 1950. And then I remember.
No, sorry. I just like going over and rewatching the pick up any notes I missed.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. Sorry, you would think that I could. I need to put like a big sign on my desk that says "Be recording." So, all right. See you guys
this afternoon.
Yeah.
When we go over the homework, are you going to be going one by one and like taking, so I can keep track of like the process of solving each one, or are you looking for like us to just say which ones we need help with?
No, I'm gonna go through all the questions, right? So I'll go through all 9 questions. If I skim over things too quickly, though, slow me down, okay? Ask a question, but I'm happy to spend as much time as you want going over the homework.
Thank you. And also, if at the end of all of that, if there's time, could I ask about certain questions from homework 1 as well?
Yeah, right. I mean, that's all we're doing is reviewing for the exam. So any questions that you have this afternoon is the time to get them answered.
Okay. Thanks, Todd.
Okay. See you later.
See ya.